Good morning, all of you. It is absolutely a pleasure for us today to be joined by a very, very phenomenal speaker, Mr. Jayant Sinha, who is a member of parliament in India. In fact, I can talk about him for hours in terms of like what are his accomplishments and things. But just a very quick thing, this is his second term as a member of parliament, if I'm not wrong. He has held various important positions within the government of India. In fact, he was the Minister for Civil Aviation. He was also the Minister with the Ministry for Finance and things. And in fact, he has been a person who has driven a lot of game-changing initiatives in India, especially things like GST and things. He might never accept what I'm saying here, but he was one of the drivers for bringing that change at that point in time. In fact, if there is one person who's had a huge impact on India's productivity and India's competitiveness, then it has to be Mr. Sinha. So that's where it is.
Amit has decided to be very kind this evening.
Oh no, Mr. Sinha, like I think I absolutely believe in what it is. And in fact, Mr. Sinha has worked with the corporate world, so he understands both sides of the world in terms of like what matters for driving microeconomics of competitiveness, how to make firms competitive, and that is what his thinking is, and that is how he drives how India needs to function. And I'm sure you will really hear a lot of interesting things for what he has to share today. But without further ado, we will ask him to really get into the talk that he has to give, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But I'm also joined by Richard Dasher. Richard is a professor at Stanford. He heads the US Asia Technology Management Center. And of course, we run this very interesting program called the India Dialogue, wherein we are doing some joint research, joint publications, and so on and so forth. And that's where it is. But without further ado, Mr. Sinha, can I actually ask you to start with your presentation, and then we'll trouble you with a lot of questions as we move forward. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Amit, and greetings to everyone on this call. That was a very kind introduction, which was very flattering and much exaggerated, but I'll take it anyway. Of course, as you probably know, Amit, and of course, a very good evening to Professor Richard Dasher as well, and to everybody that's participating on this call. But as I was going to say, Amit, you probably know that when I was doing my MBA at Harvard Business School, my competition and strategy professor was Professor Michael Porter. So I took on board, the whole thinking around competitiveness and clusters and all of that very early on in my own professional career. And I've been a very strong believer in that ever since. And I'm very glad that we are doing this program under the auspices of Stanford University, which of course is one of the great drivers of innovation around the world. And much that I will talk about, in fact, is about competitiveness and innovation. So it really is wonderful to have this opportunity to share all of that with you. So as we had discussed, Amit, maybe what I can do is I can spend about 20 minutes or so taking you all through this presentation, which I call Getting to the Green Frontier, which is really about competitiveness and innovation. And then thereafter, you all can ask me questions. So if that's all right, let me try and see whether I can get the technology to work and go on to share screen and all of that. So let me try and do that. Okay. Here we go. So can you all see the screen, Getting to the Green Frontier, the net zero development model for India? Can you all see that?
Absolutely, Mr. Sinha.
Okay, terrific. So this is, what I have distilled after many decades of thinking about what's the right development model for India. And certainly we cannot follow the development paradigms the way other countries have developed. We have to have a very unique sui generis development model for India. And what that should be is something, as I said, I've been working on my whole life. And this, in a way, distills a lot of that thinking. So that's what I want to share with you. As I said, I call it Getting to the Green Frontier, but it's really around sustainability-oriented, net zero-oriented development model. Okay, now let me see. Okay. So as you know, economists basically think about development as farm to factory. So farm to factory. That's the way people speak about development. And here's a picture of sort of Chinese farmers working in a paddy field, and then the farm to factory development model working, and then they become workers in a modern industrial textile factory. And really, the two vectors that drive farm to factory are industrialization, which increases productivity, and urbanization, which brings people together so that you have the workforce that can work in factories, take advantage of much more capital intensive means of production, and really drive GDP per capita, drive development and prosperity. So this is the way, when you talk to economists, and I've spoken to many, many of the world's top economists, continuing to ask them, which is, what is your thinking on development? And pretty much everybody says it should be farm to factory. That's what the profession knows, and that's what the profession advocates. Now, I, of course, am no economist. I'm an engineer, as you all know. So I was not satisfied with this idea of farm to factory. So another way of thinking about farm to factory is, in a somewhat more abstract way, is to say that on the one hand, on the y-axis, we have the planet. On the x-axis, we have people. And what the farm represents is a set of possibilities on the production possibilities frontier, right? So if you think about it as the production frontier, with the technology that we have in the farm, we have a certain impact on the planet, and we create a certain amount of GDP. And over time, our production frontier moves out because we have better and better technology that makes people more productive. As people become more productive, if we are lucky, then the state of the planet also improves. And at the same time, productivity improves, production increases, and people have more jobs, wealth, and GDP. So this is the more abstract way of thinking about farm to factory, because this is how industrialization and urbanization should work in the abstract sense that I'm bringing it out, which is that you're at one point in terms of your production, which is at the farm, and then you move to another point on the productivity frontier, on the production frontier, and now you're at the factory. And because you're industrializing and urbanizing in a thoughtful way, you are going up the axis in the sense of both the planet improving, and this is what happened post-industrialization. London was, full of smog and pollution, and California was a mess until they cut back on pollution and everything else. And so the planet improved, and of course GDP improved. So that's the theory. With industrialization and urbanization, we should improve our planet, our carrying capacity, and of course, people should be better off and become more prosperous. That's what development should be. The planet is better off, it's more sustainable, people are better off. And that's the theory. Unfortunately, of course, when we examine this development model for India, we find that the reality is very different. In India, what we are finding is that as we are going from farm to factory, we are actually increasing GDP, we are increasing wealth and so on. But our planetary carrying capacity, what we're doing to the planet, what we are doing in terms of sustainability, is certainly not good enough. And that's the whole area of climate change. Of course, we've got pandemics happening as well, which you could also argue are a function of zoonotic spillovers. We are encroaching on natural habitats, and that's creating these pandemics. We have water shortages, congestion. A lot of things are pointing to the fact that we are not really improving sustainability, we are degrading sustainability. And very important for a young country like India with a vast workforce, we are also not able to create enough adequate high quality jobs. So let's talk about climate change, let's talk about job creation as two of the major challenges that we face with respect to pursuing the farm to factory development model. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on climate change because all of you know it very well. Suffice it to say that when we look at parts per million in terms of carbon greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide and so on, we've gone beyond anything anybody could have anticipated. We are at 422 parts per million. The projections are we're going to go to 520, 530 parts per million. Now, when that happens, there are absolutely disastrous consequences. We have already, and this is based on the latest world meteorological analysis, but we are already at a situation where probably by 2030 we're going to start to exceed the 1.5 degrees centigrade issue of global average mean temperatures, and ranges are by 2100 that will be anywhere from 2 degrees to 2.8 degrees centigrade, maybe even 4 degrees centigrade is where we are headed with global warming. So this is where we are with respect to global average mean temperatures increasing. And I want to make a very important point here for all of you, which is that when we talk about 1.5 degrees centigrade, or we talk about 2.8 degrees centigrade, we are talking about global average mean temperatures. And don't forget, the ocean is 2/3 of the planet, right? So what happens to land temperatures is way more than what happens to global average mean temperatures. And what that boils down to is Delhi, with a max temperature of 48 degrees centigrade, is probably going to be in a situation within 20, 30 years where our max temperatures are not going to be 48 degrees centigrade, they'll be 55 degrees centigrade. 55, right? I mean, that's the kind of range we are talking about as max temperatures on land. So when people talk about 1.5 degrees centigrade or 2.8 degrees centigrade, that number hides a lot of detail as to what's going to happen to a place like Delhi, a place like Calcutta, a place like Mumbai, and so on. So what's happening in terms of climate change with carbon volumes in the atmosphere, rapidly exceeding anything we've ever seen before, and this is continuing unabated, is really, really disastrous for the world and certainly for India. Now, of course, as we know, despite all of the talk that happens and all of the best efforts that are underway, current policies and actions are taking us to somewhere between 2.5 to 2.9 degrees centigrade. And this is genuinely unsustainable. And we also have to take into account the fact that this modeling does not take into account certain very powerful tipping points that are starting to emerge, and also doesn't take into account the mutually reinforcing aspect of certain tipping points. So the ice sheets are melting in the poles, the coral reefs are dying off, the Atlantic current, the North Atlantic current is at risk of collapse. We have massive glacial melting that's already happening in India. And of course, the permafrost in the tundra and in Canada is starting to melt, which will release a lot more methane. Now, all of these things interacting with each other can become even more damaging overall. And frankly, we don't even know how cataclysmic this can be. This is beyond science right now, because modeling all of this out and figuring all of this out is very, very difficult. But this is the risk that we face in terms of cataclysmic outcomes. Now we are starting to see the impact of climate change in India already. Remember, we've had only about 1.2, 1.3 degree centigrade increase since pre-industrial times in India so far. But already we are seeing that these changing climatic patterns are increasing the risk of cyclones, they're increasing the risks of heat waves, and really extreme events in India have gone up dramatically. And of course, last year we had the situation where we had these incredible heat waves in northern India, and air temperatures, reach 46 degrees in Rajasthan, 65 degrees in Gujarat, and these heat waves are becoming, much, much more common. So this is really, really going to create a lot of pressure in South Asia. Climate scientists believe, and Professor Dasha, I think it'd be very interesting to see what it is that scientists in Stanford are modeling right now or thinking. But I was at the Harvard Climate Conference just a couple of weeks ago, and I spent a significant amount of time with some of Harvard's top climate scientists. Their concern is that the 2 billion people in South Asia, which of course includes Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and so on, are going to face some of the most difficult climatic conditions anywhere in the world because of the combination of heat and humidity that exists in India. So you, of course, know the concept of wet bulb temperatures. After 35 degrees centigrade, you can't actually stay alive. And because of the increase in heat and the high humidity that we have in South Asia, many parts of South Asia are going to become quite unlivable over a period of time. So the most number of people at risk. Yep.
Just real briefly, for those of us on the call who are more familiar with Fahrenheit, 65 degrees C is 145 degrees Fahrenheit. As a land temperature, that's more like something you find in an oven. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, exactly right.
Thank you.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. So climate change, of course, is going to be disastrous. And then, we are seeing a situation where sea levels are beginning to rise in India. Obviously, here again, the expectation from the modeling work is that sea levels will rise about 0.5 meters by 2050. As far as India is concerned, this coupled with more frequent cyclones means that we are going to get storm surges of 2 or 3 meters, which of course in places like Mumbai, Kochi, and Calcutta in the Sundarbans area is going to create some devastating impacts as well. So coastal flooding also is a very serious issue for India going forward. And as a result of the heat waves, the extreme rainfall, the thinking is that some 20% of rural districts are at very high risk. Agricultural production could easily drop by 5 to 20%, given the vulnerabilities that we have. Now, crop scientists are working on a variety of heat-resistant seeds and crops and so on. So hopefully we'll be able to deal with some of this. But the consequences in agriculture are also likely to be very profound. So again, coming back to this issue of, can we pursue a farm to factory development model? When you look at the sustainability issues associated with climate change, it's apparent that we cannot continue with this development model that the rest of the world has followed. We cannot keep pumping carbon and greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere and follow a fossil fuel dependent pathway for development. We've got to change, right? So climate change is already telling us we've kind of reached the limits to that development model. And what's even more important is that as far as carbon emissions are concerned, the next 10 years are absolutely decisive. And again, all the modeling is showing that if we stay on where we are right now, which is the business as usual scenario, total greenhouse gas emissions for India will go from 3.5 billion tons, which is where we are right now, to actually 7 billion. This is only showing carbon dioxide in this model, but greenhouse gas emissions, including methane and so on, will go to 7 billion tons. So the world cannot be going to net zero by 2050 and India going from 3.5 billion tons to 7 billion tons. But that's the trajectory we are on right now. And if we have to bend that trajectory, if we have to get to net zero by 2070 or 2050, which of course is impossible, we have to start to bend the curve now. So action is required. This is not a question of, let's worry about it 10 years from now, 20 years now. We have to start to make some very major changes to our economy right now, because the farm to factory development model is not sustainable for India. Now, that was a set of issues around sustainability, associated with climate change. Now I want to get to another set of issues that we're tackling, which is good jobs. Now, when I talk to a voter in my constituency in Hazaribagh, and we can say, here's Bhola Mehto in Tati Jharia block, which is one of the blocks in Hazaribagh. And I asked Bhola Mehto, what kind of job do you want, Bhola? Bhola will say, I don't want an informal job on a construction site. I don't want to go and work in a dhaba, that is a restaurant. I want, and if he wants to have a job in the north, he wants to be a government civil servant. And if he wants a job in the south, he wants to work in an IT services company. So you ask Bhola Mehto, what are your aspirations? He wants a good, well-paying job that gives him steady employment in the government or in a good multinational or an IT services company where he has job security and he can kind of lead his life well. So that's what Bhola Mehta wants. He doesn't want an informal job. However, when you look at how the Indian economy is doing, right now we have, and these numbers have changed a little bit post-COVID, but roughly they are right. We have a workforce of about 1 billion people. Of 1 billion people, there are about 500 million people. The number is a little bit lower, but about 500 million people that are actively looking for work. And these are, as I said, pre-COVID numbers. That labor force participation rate has gone down a little bit. But there are about 500 million people that are active workers right now in India. Of the 500 million people, 400 million people are actually in the informal sector, which means they're working in a construction site, or they're working in a dhaba, or like Bhola Mehto, they are in agriculture. That's the informal sector. That's 400 million workers. Many of them are in agriculture, actually. Then the total number of people that are in formal jobs in government, again, the person on the top here in a government job, right? That's 35 million people. And that includes federal government, state government, local government, everybody who is on the payroll for the government in India. And then there are 65 million people working in the private sector who have a regular job like Amit has. every month, his salary goes into his bank, and we can be sure that that is going to happen month after month, and he gets his benefits, and he gets health insurance, and he gets a pension, and so on. That's 65 million people. So in a way, if you think about it, there are 65 million high productivity workers that are holding up the entire Indian economy. Again, I'll repeat that. 65 million high productivity workers that are really holding up the entire economy. And out of the 65 million, about 5 to 8 million are in the IT sector, which is this picture at the bottom, right? So you have a small number of productive workers that are well integrated into the global economy that are actually holding up the $3.5 trillion of GDP that India is generating. So that's the job creation picture. Now, of course, we have lots of young people joining the workforce. Now, everybody wants a job that is a good, well-paying job. Most people don't even want a job in the private sector because they worry that they'll get terminated, laid off, whatever. Everybody in India wants a job in the government because then you have secure lifelong employment with very good pensions, and you're actually paid more than you are in the private sector. So everybody wants a government job in India. So there's another 250 million people joining the workforce, and right now we only have 35 million jobs. So how are we going to absorb them, either in the private sector or in the government sector, when we have so many people right now? So there's a tremendous pressure on job creation in India, and that's very much an important part of how we think about our development. So on the one hand, we have to deal with these sustainability challenges, and on the other hand, we have to deal with these workforce issues, which is absorbing all of these people and bringing them into high productivity, high quality employment. These are two very, very major challenges that we face. Now, what should we do with Bhola Mehto? Bhola Mehto is on a farm in Tati Jharia, Prakhand, a block in Hazaribagh. Should we make him somebody who goes and works in a factory type environment? He's an auto rickshaw driver making 50,000 rupees a month in Delhi or Ranchi. So we take Bhola Mehto from Tati Jharia and we say, "Okay, you go and you work and in Ranchi or in Delhi, and you drive an auto rickshaw and you make 15,000 rupees a month." Bhola Mehto does not want that job. When I talk to Bhola, he says, "I don't want that job. मैं किसी भी हालत में ये नौकरी नहीं करना चाहता हूँ. I don't want to do this job." And that job actually represents the current pathway. So you have Bhola Mehto here working in a farm. And if we put him on this pathway where he's driving a petrol auto rickshaw in Ranchi or Delhi, it continues along this factory, farm to factory development pathway, which is not going to lead to sustainable prosperity. So that doesn't work. Instead, what we really now need to think about are a different set of jobs, not brown jobs, not Bhola Mehto working for an auto rickshaw, but Bhola Mehto working for a green company, a company where he can make a lot more money. Let's say he makes 30,000 rupees a month, and he's working driving an electric vehicle for a company like Blue Smart, by the way, which is all electric vehicles in Delhi, right? So suddenly he's now moving from the farm to actually being a driver for an EV fleet in Delhi, working for a company like Blue Smart, using UPI digital payments, using a dispatch system on his mobile phone. And suddenly he's so much more productive than he would have been if he had stayed in the farm in low productivity agriculture, making 7,000 rupees a month. So that's really what we have to do. We have to get from farm, instead of farm to factory, what we have to do is we have to go from farm to the green frontier. That's what we need to do, is to get from the farm to the green frontier. And in the business as usual development model, we have rising emissions, insufficient job creation, limited economic growth, chaotic urbanization. It's not working, right? Instead, we need these net zero decarbonization pathways that get us to net zero emissions, high job creation, sustainable urbanization, and so on. That's the green frontier model of development for India. Instead of going off to farm to factory, we have to go from farm to green frontier. And this green frontier is defined in my development model as combining massive digitization, which is high productivity, massive digitization, and decarbonization. So digitization plus decarbonization equals the green frontier. So that's kind of my equation, right? The green frontier equals digitization plus decarbonization. So digitization plus decarbonization, sustainability, that's what puts us on the productivity frontier. That's what gives us competitiveness and sustainability. And really the way to do that is through innovation. So this red arrow actually represents innovation, Professor Dasher. So with innovation, we can digitize our business models. With innovation, we can improve sustainability. And that really is the way we have to think about development for India, not farm to factory, but farm to green frontier. We have to get to the green frontier. That should be India's development trajectory. So what does that actually mean? What does the green frontier development model actually mean? One, of course, is we've got to take our power sector, electricity system, and completely convert it to green, to renewables, and so on. 100% EVs, right? We've got to massively scale up disruptive green businesses like in green hydrogen, distributed solar, etc. And of course, we need a global carbon trading system. If we don't have a global carbon trading system where we can take our carbon credits or get pricing for the carbon emissions that we are reducing, very difficult for us to make the green frontier development model work. So at a high level, big picture, that's what the green frontier development model would look like. The power sector becomes completely renewables, 100% electric mobility. We have these green businesses, and of course, we have carbon markets working globally. And this is the path of continuous innovation. Instead of taking Bhola Mehto and putting him in a petrol auto rickshaw, we take Bhola Mehto and we put him into a blue smart type electric vehicle. And the good news, this continuous innovation, is that we have a whole bunch of companies now, that are actually at the green frontier in India. Obviously, you have Electric Pay, Ether, Ola, Chai Point, Blue Smart, NutriFresh, IdeaForge. There's a tremendous amount of innovation that's going on. And as that innovation happens, we are going more and more to the green frontier. And even India's large companies, the Tatas, HDFC, Jio, SBI, they are also moving towards the green frontier. And that, Amit, in terms of competitiveness, is what's going to improve India's overall competitiveness and enable us to succeed globally as well. So competitiveness plus sustainability, that's really what the green frontier represents. And as I said, we've got to bend the curve now. We've got to make it happen right now. We can't wait for the green frontier. It's got to happen now. Now, the other big headline I have, Professor Dasher, is that if we pursue this green frontier development model, this net zero development model, net zero is net positive. Net zero is net positive. And we've done a whole host of modeling studies with a number of different modeling groups. All of them have consistently found, whether it is the World Resources Institute, whether it's the Asia Society, Cambridge Econometrics, groups in the US, such as at the Tufts Climate Policy Lab. Everywhere we find for India, net zero is net positive. The green frontier development model is better than the farm to factory development model because GDP grows faster. And you can see that here. You can see that we create more jobs. There are more jobs created because of these green jobs. Employed population increases. We save a lot more lives because of air pollution being reduced dramatically. So obviously fossil fuels are pumping a lot of air pollution into the atmosphere. And by pursuing the green frontier, we are absolutely reducing the amount of air pollution and transitioning to a fossil-free economy. So the number of deaths that we're saving from air pollution, which is 1 to 2 million a year, is dramatic. We can save 10 million lives if we get to net zero faster. And importantly, it's making India much, much more energy secure. Today, we are already importing $250 billion of fossil fuels. This includes crude oil, natural gas, and coal, $250 billion. On our import bill of $600 billion, $250 billion of fossil fuels. And if we continue to grow our economy at 6% a year, we'll be in a situation where in real dollars, today's real dollars, we'll be importing $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year of fossil fuels. We've got to get off that trajectory. We've got to move to our own domestic energy sources. And if we go to net zero, we'll be reducing our dependence on foreign fossil fuels. So for balance of payments also makes a huge difference. So that's basically, the farm to frontier development model. What we really need is we need to get Bhola Mehto into a green frontier job. I gave the example of Blue Smart and an electric vehicle, but Bhola Mehto could also work in a modern day dairy supply chain where, his milk from his cows is being used to actually make ice cream or other high value products. and his productivity improves and he makes 30,000 rupees a month. And he can do that in his own farm, right? If we can get him plugged into these global digital supply chains. And it's not just about Bhola Mehto, it's about Geeta Oraon as well. If we can take Geeta Oraon, who's working, in a small village in Patratu block in Ramgarh district in my constituency, and we can get her a green frontier job where she's working in a company like NutriFresh, which is doing greenhouse farming and all of that, then she also becomes a lot more productive. It's a much more sustainable job, and she can also make 30,000 rupees a month. So that's the farm to green frontier. And the final rub is that to do that, we need to invest much, much more than we are investing right now. This scenario requires India to massively increase the amount of investment that's being poured into our economy over the next 30 years. We'll have to incrementally invest $3 to $5 trillion more. Today, total corporate capex in India is about $65 to $70 billion. We'll have to increase that by $50 to $100 billion. So corporate capex has to double in India to be able to build out these green frontier jobs, these green frontier companies. And for that, we will have to re-engineer the climate financial system. There's a lot of work required to do that. And that basically is what we are hoping to really encourage through the G20 presidency that India has, which is we've got to seize the climate moment. We've got to create these green frontier jobs. And by getting this kind of investment to pour into India, we can actually save India and we can save the world by pursuing a much, much more sustainable development trajectory. So I'll once again come back and say it's all about innovation. It's all about getting people the technology, the supply chain integration that can enable them to lead much, much better lives. I'll stop here. I know I've gone a little over what I said I would, but I think we've covered all the main points. Thank you very much.
Richard, why don't you start for the day?
So thank you, Jayant. What a powerful presentation. There's so much there that I think everybody needs to see in every country in the world. The increased investment that you need in India in order to make this work. One of the things that's happening through digitalization in the India economy is the shift from informal to formal that naturally happens as things go online, payment systems and so forth. To what extent will that solve the investment problem, and to what extent do you really need new investment coming from other sources?
It won't solve the problem, Professor Dasher, because the fact is that you can be in the informal sector and still use digital payments. And that's absolutely happening. You can go to India, you'll see roadside vendors, people selling vegetables, people selling food, fruit, whatever. They have a phone pay or a Paytm QR code, and you can just pay them. But that doesn't mean that they have a job, which is a formal job where they're getting a salary and so on, right? So if all the roadside vendors and all the vegetable vendors eventually started to work for quick service restaurants or started to work in big retail operations, then yes, that economy would get formalized. But as long as they're self-employed, right? Yes, they can still collect their money through a UPI payment, through digital payments, but that doesn't mean they have a formal sector job. And that's why we need investment. If we have to create these QSR restaurants, so that people, instead of buying from a roadside dhaba or buying from a golgappe ki dukaan or somebody small selling something on the side of the road, then there's got to be money that gets pumped into these QSR restaurants, and people then have a much better job when they are working in a cleaner, safer, more sanitary type situation in these kinds of formalized occupations, right? So in the US, for instance, yes, maybe in some large cities like New York, you still have roadside vendors, but they are heavily regulated and so on. But everywhere else in America, everybody's working in QSR restaurants, and it's a drive-through or whatever. But that's formalized employment. That's not informal employment where you're self-employed and trying to scramble to make ends meet. And you ask the roadside vendor, which is, do you want a formal job? Instead of making 5,000 to 10,000 rupees a month like this, the vast majority, not everyone, But 70-80% will probably say, I would prefer a secure job where I get paid 30,000 rupees a month. I have health insurance. I have a pension. My children can know that my salary is going to come in every month, etc. So people are looking for these secure jobs, and that's very, very important. But to do that, we need a lot more formalization of our economy, and that is going to be driven not so much by digitization as much as investment. So what really India needs right now is investment. So total corporate capex in India is $65 billion. That's a very, very small number, $65 billion.
Yeah. So this is something
and
where
just one quick thing on that,
investment. Yeah, please go ahead.
So, and I was saying that of the $65 billion, if you look at FDI into India, which is about $50 billion, and then you look at foreign portfolio flows in India, which sometimes are negative, but more often than not are positive, $10, $20 billion a year, you can make the case that all of corporate capex in India is actually being funded through foreign sources. So we domestically can't even fund a corporate capex right now.
So this is understandable, and I'm afraid that one of the challenges is that people can see this kind of statistics and what happens if we don't change the trajectory of development. But if you ask companies to spend more money on capex, on investment, they see the immediate, drop in profit, and it's hard to convince vested interests that this new sector of green businesses is really in everybody's best interests. Are there solutions to this problem?
No, the solution has to be policy, Professor Dasher. Obviously, if you look at the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has doled out $370 billion worth of various types of subsidies, tax credits, subsidies, etc., which will have trillions of dollars worth of impact on the economy. If you look at the money, 850 billion euros or so that the European Union is going to be spending on Fit for 55, which is their big program, or the money that's being spent by the UK and Australia and elsewhere, there are ways through industrial policy by which you can change the incentives for business to actually invest behind net zero. And that's why, Professor Dasher, I'm quite sanguine about the global north, which is the G7 countries, essentially being, or the OECD countries, essentially being able to get to net zero by 2050. And the reason is that they have the financial resources, they have the technologies, they have the companies, they have the trained manpower that can enable them to flip their economy and get to net zero. Great for the global north. Unfortunately, in the global south, including India and excluding China, which also I think will get there, if you look at the global south, you look at Brazil, you look at India, you look at South Africa, you look at Indonesia, you look at these countries, they don't have the money, they don't have the technologies, they don't have the ability to develop the right projects and implement them and generate sufficiently high returns so that more capital keeps coming. And as a result of that, their emissions are going to continue to grow. So today we are pumping out, as you know, about 60 billion tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions. What the UN modeling is showing us, and confirmed by many other independent studies, is that even as the global north gets to net zero, the global south's emission, India as an example, we go from 3.5 billion to 7 billion tons. The global south is going to continue to put out emissions. And we will go from 60 billion tons in 2022 to 50 billion tons in 2050. And that's this chart. I'll quickly go to this chart to show it to you.
Mm-hmm.
This chart. So you can see in this chart that, the projections are, we are at about 60 billion and we continue, and we remain at 50 billion. Why? Because the global south is not going to be able to reduce emissions. They don't have the money. Where is the money to reduce it? Right? And so we are not going to be able to reduce it. And what will happen is we'll end up at 2.8 degrees centigrade global average mean temperatures, which means Delhi will be at 55 degrees centigrade, and we'll have 50, 55 degree heat waves every year, and we won't have the electricity to be able to deal with that kind of heat wave. That's where we are headed right now, Professor Dasher. It's thoroughly unsustainable. It all boils down to money. And money, is because of a lot of institutional issues, that money cannot flow. And India may still be able to absorb some of that capital. What's going to happen in Nigeria and South Africa and Brazil and Indonesia, where the financial systems are even less well developed, and absorbing that amount of capital is very, very difficult. And it's very easy, for everybody to say, hey, you go to the bankers or the investors in the north and say, please invest. They'll say, well, where are the projects? I'm not investing. It's my fiduciary responsibility to generate a 12% equity IRR. And I don't see that happening in South Africa or India or whatever. So I'm not going to do it. So this is one of those classic situations which we learn about all the time, right? Which is that for individual actors, their actions are completely rational, right? But when you add it up in aggregate, classic iterated large-scale prisoner's dilemma, you add it up in aggregate, it just doesn't work. And therefore, because we are trapped in this iterated large-scale prisoner's dilemma, the only way we can break that is through policymaking and changing the incentives.
I think, that makes good sense. I have total agreement with you and hope that individually people will see this pattern and the need for all individuals to play a positive part in this. That's hard. And, for the policy to represent both that and also meaningful incentives for existing businesses to invest, it is hard, but I share your positive approach on the global north, and I hope that the global south and the north can cooperate together in this. So let me turn this over to Amit. Amit, I'm sure you have some comments and questions.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. So, Mr. Sinha, this is very fascinating in terms of the kind of approach you're saying, but I'd just like to go back to the beginning of your presentation. You make a very important point, and that is about that how rising temperatures will happen. The surface temperatures can go up to about 65 degrees centigrade in India, and so on and so forth. So that means close to about 600 million people who are living in the Indo-Gangetic plain, they can actually have severe effect of that. They might actually be devoid of water. The other question is going to be that you showed that graph of like how cities are going to recede. So that can have huge detrimental impact on urbanization. So what is that model that we have to really work on? Because it will have huge and severe social issues as well that we will have to grapple with in addition to the economic growth models and job creation and so on and so forth.
No, Amit, that's really what climate scientists are telling us right now, that we have to contend with as temperatures go up. And again, as I said, this is all baked in because 2.8 degrees centigrade now looks pretty inevitable by 2100. And obviously those are, global temperatures over a long period of time. So these kinds of heat waves and these kinds of extreme weather events could happen anytime, anywhere, right? And the example, of course, Amit, is Pakistan. What happened in Pakistan in 2022? Pakistan is going through a total macroeconomic meltdown, and that was caused by a combination of two extreme weather events linked to climate change. One, we had the extreme heat waves of April and May that triggered massive glacial melting. When there was massive glacial melting, the glacier-fed rivers of Pakistan, notably the Indus, was full up, right up to the brim with this glacial water that had melted in April and May. And then in Sindh and Balochistan that barely get any rain, they had 5 times the normal rainfall. They had extreme rainfall in the monsoon season in Sindh and Balochistan in 2022. The net result was that, the Indus, which was already full up to the brink, obviously overflowed with this extreme rainfall. And you ended up flooding a third of Pakistan. when you ended up flooding a third of Pakistan, there was a direct impact of 10 to 20% of GDP. I'll repeat, 10 to 20% of GDP got impacted. And that was just a direct impact. Naturally, when this happens, you are going to have very severe macroeconomic consequences. And that's basically what happened in Pakistan. And so the unrest that we are seeing in Pakistan, the political turmoil, the negotiations with the IMF, all of these are, to my mind at least, a direct impact of climate change. So, ये तो trailer hai, Amit, picture baki hai. So this is just a foreshadowing of what is likely to happen in South Asia. We've already seen the trailer of that movie in Pakistan. It's happening in front of our eyes. This is not something I'm making up. This is not a question of imagination. This is the here and now. If you want to read sort of the imaginative sense of what the near future holds for India, please read Ministry for the Future. I don't know, Professor Dasher or Amit or others on this call, whether you all have heard of Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future. But if you haven't, I would very strongly recommend it as probably the most imaginative and interesting depiction of what the near future under climate change would look like. And this book is set in about 2035. It starts with a heat wave in India that kills 25 million people in the Indo-Gangetic Plain.
Mm-hmm. So just moving ahead, like, and what you're really saying is the prognosis is very scary. So it just worries me at no end that as to how do we really solve this. But having what you're saying is important.
So Amit, there's a very big sustainability center at Stanford, which is staffed with some of the greatest climate scientists on the planet. Why don't you sit down with them and talk it through with them? We're just talking about climate change right now. What about the hundreds of millions of Indians that want jobs, right, or need a better quality of life? That's an equally complicated and difficult set of challenges that we have to deal with.
Absolutely. And then, of course, as we really look ahead in terms of job creation, what you're saying is, of course, we reach the productivity frontier and through green jobs or through green initiatives. But what are the kind of the number of jobs that will get created through this? Because you did allude to a very interesting fact that we will need close to about 250 million jobs until about 2047. Will this really solve the job crisis as we are really looking at it? Or is it going to be a partial function? What is it that we are really talking about? Because job creation is one of the biggest challenges as we see within the Indian context right now.
No, that's exactly right, Amit. And so a lot of the work we've done on modeling have shown that the potential is there. So if we are able to create, let's say 20, 30 million more formal sector jobs, so that the 65 million number, we can increase by 20 to 30 million. That can over time drive a lot of informal jobs as well. So can we get the informal sector to move over into the formal sector soon and completely get transformed in a few decades? That looks very difficult. But yes, we can, in fact, increase the number of formal jobs, 65 million, by quite a large number. And as we know, the ratio of informal jobs to formal jobs is about 3:1. So we could, between massively increasing formal employment and then creating indirect jobs, informal sector jobs, we could absorb the 200 to 250 million people that are coming in the next 20 years. So we can do that. Will we be able to transform then the 500-600 million people in the informal sector into formal sector jobs? That will be very difficult. But there are ways in which we can improve the quality of employment in the informal sector by providing social security, unemployment insurance, pension benefits, healthcare benefits, which we are doing, of course, through Ayushman Bharat and Jeevan Jyoti Yojana and so on. So there are a variety of ways in which social security and benefits of various kinds can be provided to the informal sector so that a safety net is created for them. But at the heart of it is we have to create more formal, high productivity jobs. If we can create 20 million more of those jobs, that can make a very big difference, because that will then generate the tax revenues to create a safety net for the informal sector as well. So it all comes back to productivity. It all comes back to creating these high quality jobs. That's really at the heart of it. We have to create these high productivity jobs. You create these high productivity jobs where people can earn more, And as they earn more, then we get more tax revenues, we can create a safety net, and we can protect people in the informal sector. So can we move everybody from the informal sector into the formal sector? Probably not. But can we improve the quality of employment in the informal sector through these social security programs? Yes. And again, I'm saying this over the next 20 to 30 years. I mean, beyond that, who knows anything? We might have nuclear fusion, and that can solve a lot of problems. But the next 20 to 30 years is really when we need to, that's the time when we got to bend the curve. We've got to absorb the workforce that we have. And that's why the next 20 to 30 years is going to be very, very crucial for India going forward. I'm 60 years old now. I just turned 60, Professor Dasher and Amit. And I'm hoping I'm going to be around for the next couple of decades, hopefully. But that, to me, everything I have seen in my life so far pales in comparison to what we need to accomplish in the next 20 years. In the next 20 years, if we can't absorb the workforce that's coming, if we can't bend the curve with respect to climate change, I think we are going to have pretty tough outcomes. Not in the global north. Stanford will remain Stanford, right? Berkeley will remain Berkeley. The Bay Area will continue to be a very pleasant place. It may be a few degrees warmer, but okay, San Francisco might become even more pleasant as a result of that, right? So the global north is going to do just fine. And the world is very good at, creating that separation between the haves and the have-nots. The elite are going to do perfectly fine, Amit. They have the money.
I have to jump in and say that the global north does have its own problems. And one of the issues with innovation is that a lot of it is not inclusive. You're reducing the number of employees required by a business. The people who are innovating are, in some ways, appropriately greatly rewarded for their innovations. They get a lot more than just the average wage. But the people who are left behind are really behind a lot of the social and political problems that we're seeing worldwide now. So I think that the key to what you're talking about is inclusive innovation that will increase more good jobs for the workforce as well as profit for the companies. How to write the policies in order to achieve that result is quite an art, I think.
No, that's right, Professor Dasher. The global north has its own set of challenges. Inclusiveness, inequality, polarization. Those are very serious issues. Obviously, even the negative impacts of various kinds of technologies like generative AI and so on. All of those have to be thought through very, very carefully. And that will require, the full attention of policymakers and elite leaders in the global north. But the only reason I am, again, as I said, sanguine about it is because the global north has had a long history of dealing with difficult challenges and being able to overcome them. There's obviously been a lot of issues and difficulties and stresses and social strife along the way. But sooner or later, these problems do get solved and a new equilibrium is attained. What I worry about with respect to the global south, Professor Dasher, is that given the scale of the challenges that we are facing, do we have the institutions, the governance, the capabilities, the trained people to be able to resolve these kinds of challenges? That's what I worry about. I think as far as the global north is concerned, also very formidable challenges. But if you look at the institutional endowments, the capabilities, there's much more hope that those problems will actually get resolved. With respect to the global south, that's a bigger set of issues. I mean, for instance, we've talked about the fact that we've got a young workforce in the global south for decades now. We've said we've got to do a better job in terms of creating, good employment for young people. And over the last 20 years, we, despite our best efforts, have only succeeded somewhat in that endeavor, right?
So to pick up on what you said at the very beginning of your presentation, this requires a different approach to innovation, not just copying the way innovation has proceeded in the already advanced countries. I think that that's the only solution for the global South to be able to achieve these goals. I think all of us have to be fully committed to this kind of a vision of the future, reducing, moving to net zero, and also increasing good jobs for the population. I really, again, I want to say thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm looking forward to seeing India as a kind of model for this new pattern of economic development, which really will be a new thing in the world.
Well, that's what we have to do, Professor Dasha.
So I have a question here, like when we really talk about the changes, and we have really talked about the corporate side of things, there has to be that individual side of things as well. And the Prime Minister has talked about something like a lifestyle for environment. How do you think these things will really get juxtaposed together? Because as individuals, like what is the kind of contribution that people can make? Because that becomes exceedingly important as well.
No, that is very important. The Honorable Prime Minister is absolutely right to point out that there have to be modifications in our lifestyle as well. India's per capita emissions are so low, and we are already moving on a decarbonization pathway, that the bang for the buck that we will get, in India from lifestyle changes is not as much as it would be in the US or other places where we have very high per capita emissions. So in the US, we need much more circularity. We need electric vehicles as quickly as possible. We need people to be much more vegan in their their food habits, etc. So in the global north, lifestyle will have a far bigger impact than in the global south. But I agree, all of us have to be very mindful of the impact that we have on our planet. Again, it's not about one individual, right? It's really about what we as a species in aggregate are doing to our planetary carrying capacity. I know this is a bit of a Malthusian view, I agree. And back to Club of Rome and limits to growth. And again, it seems like doom and gloom. I'm not a doom and gloom person. I am a technology optimist. I'm almost a techno-utopian as an engineer. And I think the answer will lie in technology, and we will solve these problems. But we have to first recognize them as being problems, and we have to recognize that we have to get on a different type of decarbonization pathway, a farm to green frontier pathway. It's only when we recognize the problem, understand what the consequences are of going down the wrong track. And as I said, if I can find that chart of bending the curve now, let's see where that chart is here. So unless we recognize that we are in that decisive decade where we're going to tip one way or the other, unless we recognize that problem and attack it, we are not going to resolve it. But once we recognize it, can we resolve it? Absolutely. Global North will certainly get there. If we take the appropriate amount of capital and invest it in the Global South will also get there, right? So it's doable, and we must do it. But we have to recognize the problem. We have to understand what is required, and we have to mobilize to get there. So I'm very much an optimist. And I think net zero is net positive. I think this is the path forward for the planet. The demographics for the planet already are very positive in the sense that global populations will stabilize at about between 8 to 10 billion over the next 50 years or so. So we do have that sort of steady state happening as far as demographics are concerned. But we need a development trajectory. We need a way of living, to your point about lifestyle, that is a lot more sustainable. Otherwise, we run the risk of certain things that can be quite disastrous. And let's not forget that there have been major extinctions in the past, right? There was the Permian extinction about 250 million years ago. And then, of course, when the asteroid hit the planet 65 million years ago, there was the massive extinction that happened then. So yes, we do hit certain thresholds with respect to planetary carrying capacity. And then impacts do happen. And many of these impacts, by the way, are triggered by external events. We get to a situation where volcanoes, this is why the Permian extinction happened. We had these super volcanoes that put a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that triggered a massive extinction. In fact, the dinosaurs happened because of the Permian extinction. So in any case, the point I'm making is it's not that there aren't these big, large-scale planetary changes. There are. Is that a Malthusian notion? No, it's a realistic notion. Right? Is it doom and gloom? No, it's recognizing that there are planetary tipping points. There are planetary thresholds that we have to be mindful of. Does life continue beyond that? Yes. Are there major extinction events as a result of that? Yes. I mean, that's all in the historical record, the planetary record, whether we acknowledge it or not.
Oh, wow. So this is something very, very fascinating, Mr. Sinha. And I know like we're already up our time, but I think, I guess, to what you're saying, we need to really work towards what you're suggesting, because if we don't do that, we are talking about survival of the human species. We are talking about a very
there is a fairly well-known gentleman who has a big space company that's trying to put people in Mars. Am I right, Amit?
So we are not naming him here, but of course, like there are those changes that are distinctly possible. But what you're really saying is, like, I do take away 2 or 3 things here. Like, one is we have to work towards what you're really suggesting. We have to really look at the green technologies. We have to really alter the business models, because if we don't do that, survival of the species is at stake. The second thing is,
No, I don't say that. Amit, I'm not saying survival of the species is at stake. I don't believe that. As I said, the global north is going to do just fine. I think there's going to be a real setback, particularly to the global south, if we don't get a handle on some of these problems. The elite in their marina, county houseboats, and in their Napa Valley vineyards, and in the La Jolla condos are going to do just fine, right? They've always done just fine. But
sure
the problem, the problem, of course, is that we have a lot of vulnerable people in the global south, and we have to be, if we care about humanity, we have to care about them. We can't just worry about, our Malibu beach house.
And I think, as to what you're saying, it is all about reimagining capitalism. In fact, that's a course that Richard and I teach. But I think exactly to what you're saying, we need to reimagine the models of growth. We have to really revisit as to how we've been really thinking about capitalistic systems. And that's exactly what we see here. So we need to look at that. We need to take action now, and that's how it is going to be. But I think as all things have to come to a close, I really have to thank you, Mr. Sinha, for really joining us today. It has just been such a fascinating interaction. I'm sure we could have gone on for hours on this conversations. I have too many questions. I have a page full of questions for you, which if you hazard, I'll send it to you, the list of questions that I have. But we look forward to having you again sometime in the near future. Maybe possibly have you at Stanford in person and have an audience to really talk about.
Well, I believe you have an interesting visitor from India coming soon to Stanford.
So it's not a belief, it's a fact. So I must admit that as well. So he's your Mr. Gandhi is going to be there. I must accept that.
I'm sure he has a lot of these answers.
If he could, now we will not get into the political schmeal here, but what you're suggesting is something very interesting, and I would like to thank.
No, I think it'd be good. It would be good to pose some of these questions to him and say, what do you think is India's development model?
I will certainly do that. In fact, on 31st, I'll certainly do that, which I do know. So that we will take care of that. But having said that, I think thanks a lot for joining in. But I would just like to tell the audience that the next conversation is going to happen on June 21, wherein we'll have Sean Rondolph and others coming in to really have a conversation with us. But Richard, if you would like to say something before we take leave from Mr. Sinha.
Just thank everyone for participating in a very important dialogue conversation this morning. Thanks so much, Mr. Sinha. This has been enlightening and in some ways inspiring, because I think that all of us need to get behind this idea. It will work if each individual person will make a personal commitment to playing a positive role in this. So thank you so much for bringing this to us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good evening.
Thank you, Mr.
Dasher.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Richard.